First at 9 o'clock, the latest news with Martin Lewis.
The American government says it is deeply concerned that a terrorist attack on US interests in Western Europe is imminent. A security alert after fears of an attack to coincide with Sunday's anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. And the United States says the Soviet Union has made a key concession in the talks on strategic nuclear arms. Good evening. The US State Department said tonight it was deeply concerned about the possibility of a terrorist attack on American citizens or installations in Western Europe. And it's afraid that it could take place on or near Sunday, the 11th anniversary of Iran's Islamic Revolution. The department said additional alerts would be issued if it obtained specific information on the alleged attack or its target. Today's comes 3 months after another warning prompted by the discovery of weapons bound for pro-Iranian groups in Spain and Africa.
The sixth time.
The surprise announcement was made without warning towards the end of a State Department briefing.
The United States government is deeply concerned that terrorists may now be planning an operation against U.S. interests in Western Europe, which may be timed for on or about February 11th. At present, we do not have specific information about the nature of the terrorist operation or about its target.
Mr. Boucher refused to enlarge on his statement except to stress that so far there was no specific information about a particular target or particular European country. But the fact that the statement has been made at all and the use of the words deeply concerned shows just how seriously the US government is taking the information, given that it will cause concern not only to hundreds of thousands of American visitors and residents in Europe, but anyone using American facilities or flying on American aircraft. Quite clearly, the government here does not want to be accused, if there's an attack, of withholding information that might have saved lives, as it was after the bombing of the Pan Am flight over Lockerbie. Accusations that the US government had advance information that a terrorist attack was in the offing, yet did nothing to warn the general public, were made by relatives of some of the 270 victims. Hezbollah, the Party of God, is a Shia Muslim organization based in Lebanon. It's anti-Western and particularly anti-American, and its activities are particularly difficult to combat because many of its members are quite prepared to embark on suicide missions. The most successful of those was the attack on the US Marine barracks in Beirut, where nearly 250 Marines were killed. And it has an infrastructure already in place in Europe, thanks to the efforts of Ali Akbar Mohtashemi, the former Iranian interior minister and founder of Hezbollah, and a man dedicated to exporting the Islamic Revolution. Ominously, perhaps, he recently paid a visit to Beirut to talk with Hezbollah members there. Last November, 3 Hezbollah members were picked up in Spain along with an arms cache. They'd been dispatched on a terrorist attack somewhere in Europe, and their interrogation first alerted the authorities on both sides of the Atlantic to the very real threat of further attacks. Since then, security on American airlines, at US installations and European tourist centers where Americans congregate has been tightened. But experience of Hezbollah shows that given their fanaticism and ruthlessness, they're very difficult to combat. Keith Graves, BBC News, Washington.
9 Iranians suspected of plotting to assassinate the author Salman Rushdie were deported from Heathrow Airport today. Mr. Rushdie has been in hiding for a year since Ayatollah Khomeini called for his death over the publication of the Satanic Verses. The Home Secretary David Waddington ordered today's deportations for what were described as reasons of national security. The Soviet Union has made a key arms control concession, removing one of the stumbling blocks to a strategic nuclear arms treaty. The shift in the Soviet position came after talks in Moscow today between the American Secretary of State James Baker and his Soviet counterpart Edward Shevardnadze. The Soviets are no longer insisting that strategic arms reductions must be linked to American Star Wars research.
The foreign ministers are meeting in an atmosphere dominated by yesterday's revolutionary changes in the Soviet Union. Edward Shevardnadze, hoping his country's domestic reforms would persuade the West to treat it as a democratic partner.
I think it'll mean that we are going to have more elements of trust in our relationship and more mutual respect and mutual understanding between us.
But the Kremlin's real need is for its foreign policy successes to reap dividends for its domestic economy. Mr. Shevardnadze this evening indicating that Moscow is now ready to proceed towards major cuts in strategic nuclear weapons without linking the agreement to curbs on Washington's Star Wars program. But if democracy is useful on the international scene, it's already proving uncomfortable at home. Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhkov forced to recognize the political muscle of a liberated workforce, flying straight from the plenum to reassure Arctic miners, whose strikes last year boosted the campaign for multi-party democracy, that their demands had been answered.
I have to let the people here know about the decisions made by the plenum, the atmosphere there, and our view of the most vital question, the future of our party.
With threats of new strikes forcing the Kremlin to tread carefully with the workers, another potential crisis continued to grow in Lithuania. The Republic's parliament declaring its forcible incorporation into the Soviet Union in 1940 null and void, effectively removing Moscow's legal arguments for refusing its demands for secession, and indicating that Mr. Gorbachev's visit to Lithuania last month had done little to curb separatist sentiment. The head of the breakaway Lithuanian communists, Algirdas Brazauskas, revealing that the Central Committee yesterday voiced strident but ineffectual criticism of his party.
Their judgment was very harsh.
The Kremlin's democratic reforms have won praise from the West, but they've also revealed the vast depth of problems in this huge and rebellious country, boosting conservative claims that only the iron fist of autocracy can hope to keep control, and leaving Mr. Gorbachev in need of continued and improbable successes at home and abroad to prove them wrong. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
Police in South Africa have used tear gas to break up a protest against the rebel cricket tour. Around 2,000 demonstrators defied a ban to try to march from the township of Alexandra to the cricket stadium in Johannesburg, where the English cricketers began their first game against the South African national side.
The Pro Tour demonstration in Johannesburg went ahead unhindered as the Freedom in Sport movement towed its slogan through a grey sky above the pitch. Many of the Africans who took up their seats in the stadium this morning had been provided with tickets by Freedom in Sport, but they were closely scrutinised by security police at the entrance nonetheless. Before the match began, Mike Gatting received a petition in support of the tour. Meanwhile, in the volatile African township of Alexandra a few miles away, thousands of youngsters made their way towards the bus station, hoping to join a demonstration against the tour. They didn't get far. No permission had been granted for the demonstration, and soon there were skirmishes between riot police and would-be demonstrators through the township's squalid streets. Some demonstrators were arrested, so too were cameramen trying to record the event. Despite the easing of restrictions on newspapers, the government has given notice that it will continue to control photography of what is called unrest. Outside the stadium itself, would-be demonstrators were moved on, obliged to gather in the street well away from their intended target and still under the eye of watchful policemen. Their planned demonstration against the tour never got off the ground. But they managed to make their point in the centre of Johannesburg, outside the British consulate.
The demonstration here is for Margaret Thatcher. The summons getting home. Getting must go home.
The Deputy Consul General, Norman Ling, ushered their leaders courteously into the lift to take them upstairs for a chat. Here at least the demonstrators had their say before the police moved in once again to break up their gathering. Michael Sullivan, BBC News, Johannesburg.
The South African government says death threats against Nelson Mandela are delaying his release from prison. Law and Order Minister Adriaan Vlok said white extremists and dissident factions within the African National Congress have both threatened to kill Mr. Mandela.
For Nelson Mandela, freedom will also bring danger. The neo-Nazis of the AWB, incensed by his imminent release, are heavily armed, and the far right demonstrated its firepower earlier this week, attacking the British Embassy in Pretoria. Today, South Africa's Law and Order Minister said there had been a series of death threats from both white and black extremists.
And we are concerned about his safety, because, you know, he has been threatened from the right, that is so, but also from within his own ranks.
The minister says discussions with the ANC how to protect Mr. Mandela are a factor delaying his release. And this evening, Walter Sisulu, welcoming the Reverend Jesse Jackson to Soweto, made clear a police bodyguard for Mr. Mandela was unacceptable. Around the crowd today, plainclothes police much in evidence, but indications are the government will consent to armed ANC guards for Mr. Mandela, although the ANC were branded terrorists until their unbanning last Friday. Until the details are agreed, Mr. Mandela remains in jail. James Robbins, BBC News, Johannesburg.
There has been more severe flooding across Britain after last night's storms in which 2 people died. Worst hit were Wales and southern England, where some roads and railways remain closed and thousands of homes are without electricity. This evening, serious flood alerts are still in force along the rivers Wye and Severn and on a 60-mile stretch of the Thames between Wallingford and Teddington.
Once again, southern England and Wales took the full force of the storms, here testing Brighton Marina's defences for the second day running. Through the day, heavy seas have forced delays and cancellations in the Channel, and more bad weather is expected over the weekend. In South Wales, the storms washed away this football pitch at Pontarwine near Newport. The goal has become a waterfall, washing tons and tons of mud and debris down into nearby houses.
My father-in-law came up and well, he was dropped off. He had phoned me, and he said they had a problem.
As the mud rushed down the hillside, cars were buried in their garages, and on the hill above, a landslide carried away the sports pavilion, just as the builders had finished.
But it's all come down, there's nothing stopping it, it's all just poured down here, you know. And those down the bottom, I mean, I was flooded. But that is front window wet. I never seen anything like it, never. It was mush and all the glass and everything came out the old window. Terrible, I never seen, all the years I've ever never seen anything like that, never.
On the Welsh borders, hundreds of thousands of acres are once again underwater. Here at Hereford, the River Wye rose to a record 16 feet this afternoon. And the National Rivers Authority are predicting more flooding along the Wye, the Avon and the Severn.
People who were flooded last week and hope that the worst was over are going to have to prepare for another dose, because we are predicting that the river will continue to rise well into tomorrow and possibly into the weekend.
At Diblis Loch near Worcester, the Severn has already risen 5 feet in 24 hours. This pensioner has had to cope with 5 days of flooding in her home, and now she can only stand and watch as the Severn rises again over the sandbags guarding the way to her front door.
The House of Lords has given its backing to research on human embryos. It's the first time the issue has been the subject of a free vote in Parliament. During a debate on the embryo research bill, the Lords voted by a majority of more than 150 against an amendment which would have banned embryo research. But the bill still has to pass through the House of Commons.
The vote was a landslide for those in favour of continuing embryo research. 234 votes in favour of research and only 80 against. It was a crucial first test of opinion in Parliament.
80 not content, 234. So the not contents have it.
It's a unique government bill with 2 alternative clauses, one banning all embryo research, the other allowing it to continue as now for up to 14 days under special licence. The debate brought out the strongest feelings. On one side, scientists said they could prevent genetic disease and help infertile women bear children. Against them stood those with a deep moral objection to any interference with human life.
I cannot accept that a man has a right to dispose of what is living, to bottle it, to tag it, to place it on a shelf, to play with it, to destroy it. Because I profoundly believe, my lords, that our ancestors were wiser in their generation over the verities of life and death. I believe, my lord, that man must not do this.
While I understand the sincerely held objections of the opponents of research who believe that the embryo begins at conception, nevertheless I find it very difficult personally to see how anyone deeply concerned about the welfare of suffering humanity could fail to recognize the potential benefits of such research.
But today's vote is only the first of many, and the campaigns on both sides will continue until the bill has passed on through the House of Commons. It has come as a profound setback to the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child.
We're bitterly disappointed by the vote today, although we aren't surprised. We've always recognised that our strength is in the Commons, and that's where our main battle lies.
There was relief and new optimism amongst those campaigning for embryo research, although they're well aware that they've only won the first round.
I believe this is a victory for those who are interested in the improvement of in vitro fertilization for the treatment of fertility, but perhaps above all for those interested in the prevention of genetically determined disease.
The House of Lords, filled with eminent scientists and academics, backed by the Archbishop of York, was always more likely to vote in favour of research. Maybe a different story in the Commons, where straw polls have shown more MPs may vote against. MPs are more vulnerable to the ferocious lobbying they've been receiving on this issue.
Bank accounts held in Britain by the deposed Panamanian dictator General Manuel Noriega have been frozen. The High Court ruling follows an inquiry by officers from the National Drugs Intelligence Unit at Scotland Yard. General Noriega is awaiting trial in the United States on drug trafficking charges.
When American troops marched into Panama in December, they found a mountain of paper relating to General Noriega's bank accounts. While the deposed dictator awaits trial in Florida, the suspected drugs money has been frozen in Switzerland, Luxembourg, France and Austria. But the City of London also seems to have been an important home for the Noriega wealth. Originally, it was thought there were fewer than 10 accounts, with holdings of around £500,000. But police sources said today the amounts ran into millions. Scotland Yard's National Drugs Intelligence Unit handled the American request to freeze Noriega accounts, and the order was granted in the High Court today. No details were given of the banks involved. Banks are finding themselves increasingly caught up in complicated transatlantic schemes to launder money. In Florida this week, 2 subsidiaries of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International were fined $15 million for laundering drugs money. The Bank of England and the government are becoming more worried about London being used as a drug laundering centre. In recent weeks, all banks and building societies have received tough warnings that they must choose their customers more carefully.
Shop stewards representing London's ambulance crews have rejected calls to negotiate a local settlement of their pay dispute. But a union leader conceded that there was a tremendous amount of frustration among crews who wanted an end to the 5 months of industrial action. Tomorrow, union representatives from across the country meet to discuss their next move.
A number of shop stewards arrived for the meeting, saying it was now time to call for a separate pay deal for London, even if it meant abandoning their colleagues elsewhere.
They all feel that we should go for a separate deal in London. We've led the way, obviously. Let's end it.
Are you angry that the rest of the country hasn't come into line?
Yeah, very angry. Very angry. It's brought, it certainly has. It's made us, a lot of us want a local deal because of that.
But after nearly 3 hours, the vote was a decisive 45-17 against calls for a local settlement.
It was certainly discussed. It was discussed at some length, but we feel that that's not the way that this dispute should be finished.
I didn't need to do any persuading at all. The London shop stewards had decided that this is a national dispute. All of their colleagues up and down the country involved in it, and the London membership are not going to do a local deal. Make no mistake about that, and I didn't have to persuade them about it.
But despite Mr. Poole's confidence, there's growing frustration among crews in the capital at what they claim is a lack of direction in the dispute. Several stewards were angry that they'd never been told about talks which took place last week between Chris Humphreys, a senior union officer, and Bill Taylor, a London ambulance service official, at which it emerged that more money might be made available for London crews. Union leaders are adamant they'll only accept a national settlement, but the real test will come next week, when shop stewards from all over Britain meet to decide their next move. Some now believe it's time to ask crews if they want to continue their action or go back to work.
A committee of MPs has strongly criticised the system for compensating victims of violent crime. It says a scandalous backlog has built up with more than 100,000 people waiting for claims to be processed. The report by the Home Affairs Select Committee says the average wait for compensation is now more than a year. This report from our legal correspondent, Joshua Rosenberg.
Thomas Hearn was out walking one evening near his home in South London when a man asked him for money. Mr. Hearn refused and the man lunged at him with a knife.
I was stabbed 3 times and kicked and punched and robbed. Badly injured, I was taken to hospital. I was fortunate to escape my life without being seriously and permanently maimed.
Mr. Hearn lodged a claim with the government's Criminal Injuries Compensation Board more than a year ago, and all he's had from them so far is a card asking him not to phone up and increase the delay. Today's report speaks of an organisation sinking under mounds of paper. Computers were recommended in 1982, but they still haven't arrived. The MPs say that victims are being frustrated by delays of more than a year. There's now a backlog of around 100,000 cases.
That is a scandal. It is not the way to compensate victims of crime, and that is not what Parliament intended when this excellent scheme was established.
For 25 years now, the scheme has been paying out sums ranging from a few £100 for a broken nose to as much as £500,000 for a man whose life was devastated after an assault. The Commons report calls for extra staff, rapid computerisation to speed up cases, and increased publicity to encourage more claims. The man who now chairs the Compensation Board endorses many of the MP's criticisms.
We are anxious to get on with the computer programme. We're anxious to try and find more efficient ways of dealing with our cases, and we have been trying to find ways of dealing with them earlier.
The Home Secretary David Waddington recently announced changes to reduce the number of people entitled to compensation. Today the Home Office said these changes would speed up claims. It was urgently considering the board's request for more staff.
Brazil's next president, Fernando Collor de Mello, has met Mrs. Thatcher, cabinet ministers and top banking officials for talks in London. Mr. Collor de Mello is touring world financial centres looking for help to shed his country's crippling foreign debt. But everywhere he's been met with increasing concern over the destruction of the Amazonian rainforest.
Next month, President-elect Fernando Collor de Mello will inherit the third world's biggest debt, all $120 billion of it. That issue topped the agenda when he met the Prime Minister today. But his visit has been dominated by Brazil's other problem.
Save the Yanomami! Let them have their land!
The plight of the Yanomami tribal Indians and the rainforest they live in is the issue conservationists want Mr. Collor de Mello to address. Mr. Collor says he's just as interested in saving the rainforest as the demonstrators outside the Brazilian embassy today. But in a speech to businessmen, he warned that for Brazilians, ending poverty was just as important. He said there was a limit to the amount of money Brazil could spend on the environment. He's likely to have got a sympathetic hearing when he met Prince Charles today. Earlier this week, he said there was a link between debt and the environment.
I really don't see how developing countries can be expected to achieve sustainable development and at the same time meet huge debt repayments.
But some economists say debt relief on its own holds no guarantee of better environmental policies.
Debt write-off doesn't offer any particular incentive for the borrowing country to invest in environment. It frees up resources, obviously. Resources that didn't go in interest payments can now be put back into the economy, but we have no guarantee that they'll be put back into the environment. Why assume that when they might continue with the previous policies that have contributed to the indebtedness in the first place?
The challenge facing conservationists in rich countries is to make it economically worthwhile for poor countries to save the environment.
There are no guarantees in international politics, but we do guarantee the destruction of the rainforests unless we halve their debt, and it would be the strongest incentive we could possibly give them.
If a global solution isn't found soon, vast tracts of the rainforest are unlikely to survive the next few decades. Last year alone, just under 2% of tropical forest was destroyed. Whatever the arguments, all sides now agree that stopping the destruction is as much an economic issue as an environmental one.
Nearly 4 years after the Chernobyl disaster, thousands of Ukrainian villages are still being exposed to dangerously high levels of radiation. Many were not evacuated and now blame the disaster for their ill health. As Bill Turnbull reports, they have lost faith in the government and the doctors who failed to protect them.
This is the land known as the Dead Zone. No one has lived here for nearly 4 years because of radioactive contamination from Chernobyl. The ground behind these fences is too dangerous to enter. Officially, though, the main road which runs between them is safe enough to travel on. After the disaster in April 1986, tens of thousands of people were evacuated from villages like this. Houses and farms deserted, vast areas of land abandoned to nature. But only half a mile away, this village is still inhabited, even though the authorities have known it's been contaminated for more than 3 years. The level of radiation here before the disaster was 0.02 milliröntgens. The readings we've been getting in this village today, though, have been up to 1.55, more than 70 times as high, and 6 times greater than the highest acceptable levels in Britain. Nuclear experts in the West say this community should have been evacuated long ago, but life here continues as normal.
We would like to leave, but where can we go? Youngsters can find work on other farms, but we're retired. No one wants old people.
In the nearby town of Noriega, it's the children who are causing most concern, for they appear to be feeling the worst effects. Their parents say they suffer from headaches and fatigue, and their eyesight is deteriorating.
Just look at our poor children. My daughter has a swollen thyroid gland. For 4 years we've been living with this radiation. They've been promising to move us, but nothing has happened. The authorities haven't done anything for us.
The citizens of Noriega no longer trust the government or the doctors. Instead, hundreds of them converged on the town from surrounding villages, frantically seeking a cure for their ills from a faith healer. Alexander Kashpirovsky is a household name in the Soviet Union, famous for his televised attempts at mass hypnosis. He is the last hope for the people here, for they are trapped in an environmental nightmare which is still unfolding, and which will haunt their children for the rest of their lives. Bill Turnbull, BBC News, Noriega.
Tonight's main news again. The American government says it is deeply concerned that a terrorist attack on US interests in Western Europe is imminent. And the Soviet Union has made a key concession in the talks on strategic nuclear arms. Newsnight tonight has a major review of Britain's defences, with senior members of the armed forces giving their own ideas for radical arms cuts. That's Newsnight on BBC 2 at 10:30. This has been the 9 o'clock news. Good night.
The main stories tonight. Plans to close 4 fire stations in London have been turned down. In a surprise decision this afternoon, the London Fire and Civil Defence Authority voted 5-4 not to make any cuts to the service. The Fire Brigades Union and the Association of London Authorities had opposed the measure. A 23-year-old hotel porter has been jailed for life at the Old Bailey for murdering his girlfriend because she'd become a burden. 19-year-old Tracy Illman was stabbed 60 times in front of the couple's 5-month-old son. Bruce Santos from southeast London was caught after an imprint of Tracy's ring was found on his forehead. The court heard that he wanted to set up home with his new lover who witnessed the attack. 3 appeal court judges have reserved judgment in a case which will decide whether Hammersmith and Fulham Council's financial dealings are lawful. 5 banks are seeking to overturn last November's ruling that the council's interest rate swap deals were illegal. If that ruling is upheld by the appeal court, the council hopes to avoid having to repay more than £100 million in debts to the banks. The electronics group GEC is closing its factory in Welwyn Garden City in Hertfordshire with the loss of 130 jobs. It's to move its operation to other sites in the county. The company says it hopes to redeploy some of the Welwyn workers. The Royal Shakespeare Company is to close its 2 London theatres for 4 months. The company says it's a last-ditch attempt to balance the books. The company faces a deficit of £2.5 million this year. The Barbican and the Pitch Theatres will close from November. The RSC has said there'll be no redundancies. And that's all from Newsroom South East tonight. Now we take a look at the weather and we join Suzanne Charlton.
Good evening. England and Wales have had a bit of a respite from the stormy conditions today. In fact, many central and eastern areas turned out very sunny indeed, with some 8 or 9 hours of sunshine. And even on the satellite picture this evening, we can still pick out those clear skies. In fact, the indications for tomorrow's weather show up on here too. We're going to be attacked from 2 directions. The first area of cloud that'll be coming in is up here. That'll continue to push its way down towards northwestern parts of the country. And then this rather flat-looking area of cloud, that'll slide its way up towards the English Channel. But as we can also pick out on these very useful satellite pictures, rather a lot of shower cloud already massing out just on the western side of the country. And indeed, it's in the west that we're really going to see most of the showers, I think, during the night. Now, no doubt 1 or 2 will pop across further east, but for the most part the showers will be pegged back around these western coasts and hills. Just a few of them down in the southwest, rather more the further north you go, and they'll be rather heavier up in the north too, with some snow up on the hills. For central and eastern regions, well, it's frost that we're going to have to look out for, and with some damp surfaces around, no doubt, some icy patches on 1 or 2 open stretches out of doors too. In fact, temperatures in central and eastern parts of England, parts of eastern Wales and eastern Scotland could drop down close to freezing, just 2 or 3 degrees or so above freezing out in the west, but a widespread ground frost. By tomorrow, we'll be attacked by those 2 areas of weather from the northwest and from the southwest. Up in Scotland and Northern Ireland, the cloud and rain will come in, and it'll turn to snow for a time over the hills before turning back to rain. A bright start too down in many southern regions, but I think we'll see the clouds spilling in, and the extreme southwest and parts of the Channel Islands will probably have some rain by the afternoon. Sandwiched in between, a mixture of sunshine and showers. Again, most of the sunshine over in the east and the showers in the west. Temperatures around 7 or 8 in the north, 8 to 10 in the south. That's all from me. A very good evening.